We all have imaginations. It's one of those built-in functions of our human brains. We have the ability to have an image of something which is actually not real. What we know from neuroscience is that when we imagine something happening, the same neurons actually fire in our brain as fire when we experience that same something in real life. For example, and this is one that is very handy in a time of social isolation. If I can focus and generate in my mind a very vivid image of one of my grandchildren sitting in my lap, the same neurons will fire in my brain as would fire if I actually had that grandchild sitting here. And those neurons trigger then the same brain chemicals that give me pleasure from the actual event. And no, it isn't quite the same as reality. The reality doesn't require me to use as much brain power to create and sustain the imagined experience, but it is at least something. And by imagine and and getting images, I don't just mean visual images. For some people, imagination does present vivid visual images. And for other people, other senses get invoked with imagination, including taste and touch and feel and sound. We don't know to what extent other animals have the ability to imagine. Perhaps they have some, but it's rudimentary compared to our brains that are more developed in that area. I think here of the gorilla Coco, who learned to communicate through sign language. One year, she asked for a kitten, and when given a stuffed cat, she was not impressed. So the researchers found for her a real kitten, a tailless kitten, which Coco then named All Ball. Coco treated the kitten like her own baby. And when her first kitten died, Coco cried. Well, think about that. To be sorrowful about losing that kitten, Coco had to have some imagination that the kitten could have still been there, and compare that to the kitten not being there. Sorrow and sadness are ways in which imagination can show up in our lives. Coco did, by the way, go on to get a new kitten and then others over Coco's lifetime. So, how else does imagination show up in our lives? Emotions like anticipation, where we imagine something happening in the future and get some of the emotional enjoyment as we imagine what it will be like. Blaming someone is based on imagining that they could have done otherwise. Shame includes an image of how we could have behaved, how we might have come off differently in a situation. Worry is a focus on what the worst might be. We are imagining much of the time. In fact, it takes a lot of discipline to learn how not to live either in the memory of the past, which is a kind of imagination, or to live in the vision of what our future could be, bad or good, which is another kind of imagination. To live in the present, enjoying what is without being distracted by the past or what we should be doing instead or what could go wrong, to live just in the now is a very valuable discipline. But it is a discipline because imagination is so natural. One of the uses of imagination is to escape the present. And in the context of what's going on in our country right now, I have to say, conspiracy theories with elaborate explanations for why things are the way they are, theories that are not based in fact, but on someone told me this, or often out of one's own, I'm connecting the dots. Yesterday, I read, just because I thought it was essential to try to understand a way of thinking, a very long posting by someone who is involved with the so-called QAnon trend or cult or collection of conspiracy theories. I have heard from both right and left that the National Guard troops in DC now, more troops in DC than in Iran and Afghanistan combined, are really there to keep Trump in power this week. And let's face it, that is one way to use one's imagination to look at the bare facts that there are troops there and imagining a rationale that may not be based on any hard evidence, but on ideas in our head. Or worse, and this is part of the theories that are going around now, the stories that Dominion voting systems hacked this election. Now, I have been a strong critic of many electronic voting systems for years. When I lived in Virginia, I hated the years that I had to vote completely on a machine, not fully trusting the software and hardware, and that they weren't manipulating the vote total. But the accusations this year that there was a major conspiracy by Dominion to steal the election and massively changing votes, that just was not based on facts. And now we see many media companies beginning to retract their stories because those accusations were made up by someone with an agenda and then believed by those who could not imagine that a much larger number of Black voters voted than in previous elections. Now, the last week of this month, we'll be participating in a platform meeting with other ethical societies on the topic of moving from magical thinking, which is a kind of imagination, to rational discourse. And there's sure many ways in which our culture needs that shift. But I also think there's ways in which we need more imagination. So, what then do I mean about freeing our imaginations, and why do I think that's also important? In short, I think that some of the imaginations, like conspiracy theories, actually substitute for more robust imagination. Conspiracy theories are imagination constrained into defending an existing belief, mustering facts to fit the conclusion, and imagining rationales. I also think about imagination when I remember my teenage years. In that time, I discovered the TV show Star Trek. I really loved watching that with its images of a different future. Yeah, there were some episodes I found dumb and annoying, using imagination in a really clunky way. The real Star Trek fans might remember one story of a planet where all the women lived underground and wore short skirts and high go-go boots. On the other hand, there was a different world and a different universe there where a Russian man and a Black woman were co-equal colleagues in a universe of people exploring new worlds and new civilizations. Other stories on the show were more substantive. It wasn't long before I figured out that the new civilizations they were depicting were actually all variants on very human tendencies. None of the civilizations was completely alien. It was a creative way of exploring the human psyche and how we behave towards each other, especially how we behave towards people who are different. I had loved science fiction for many years before discovering Star Trek, and I think for similar reasons. In college, I read an essay about science fiction by the sci fi and fantasy author Ursula Le Guin. She said there something that stuck with me, that all science fiction is exploration of ethics. It's imagination used in service of ethical thinking, how we behave towards one another. You know, in an interesting connection, a much later Star Trek series has in it a starship named the Le Guin. Back in my Star Trek Discovery years, I was even one of those who began to write what is called fan fiction, stories set in the Star Trek universe. But really, as I look back on it, some combination of exercising my own imagination and working out issues that I thought that universe presented. But the shaming in most of our culture of that kind of writing shut off my confidence in writing for a very long time. I've actually never gone back to writing fiction. I suppose my almost 20 years writing mini biographies for one part time job substituted for a bit of the feeling of writing fiction. With biographies, I'm writing about facts as much as I can, but I still have to use my imagination to string those facts together into a coherent whole. And occasionally use facts to free my imagination to see connections others had not. For another example, for a few years, I was writing about the Salem witch trials, mini articles over a couple of years. I was piecing together many connections. Many writers have theories about why those trials happened, why so many people were accused of witchcraft, and why the people who made the accusations were believed. The accusers, I believe, were exercising their imaginations, consciously or unconsciously, and then they inspired others to do so too. Connecting facts like angry words spoken to a neighbor and then that neighbor falling sick to imagine that somehow the angry words had deliberately created the sickness. I guess the Salem witch trials are another example of conspiracy theories in a different culture context. And since then, in looking at how those accusations spread, I've done some family trees of the people involved. I first did it while I was writing about it to get straight in my own head who was who. The Salem villages had many intermarriages in them. And I discovered some family connections among those accused that others had missed before. And then I could apply my imagination to guess some of the reasons people might have been accused was because of their family relationships to people who either had already been accused or who criticized the accusers. There's so many ways in which imagination can be used for expanding our horizons or for narrowing them. For imagining a more open future or imagining a past and present that fits our preconceived notions about the worst that could happen. Freeing our imaginations means freeing our visions from just being in service of our prejudices. To look at imagination a bit differently than just conspiracy theories and science fiction and fantasy stories, remember that imagination has many different functions, and there are many kinds of imagination. I had us do the reflection we did this morning so that maybe we could see some of the different ways in which people use imagination. Imagination is a built in part of our minds, but we use that facility differently. I've talked about two of the ways already, conspiracy theories or fiction and fantasy, but there are more. I thought it might be interesting to look up what some others have explored before me. And I found that there was one person who had tried to look at how imagination is different depending on personality type. So, here in very summary form are 16 different kinds of imagination. And as I'm reading them, see if any of these ring true for you. A kind of therapy, escape via envisioning entire fantasy worlds. A practical vision of where current reality might likely lead. Seeing many possibilities and tangents. A vision of how to make life better for yourself and others. Connecting dots to solve problems. Interpreting facts and reading between the lines. Intuitive leaps, shifting perspective via engagement with the world. Conceptualizing solutions and mapping out plans and strategies. Remembering the past, especially connected with senses. Or remembering many details and fondly revisiting events of the past. Strong and detailed memories, especially of how the sequence of events happened. Coming up with ideas based heavily on what's already familiar. Fantasizing about having exciting experiences and what they might feel like. creating and crafting things from scratch, imagining our own success and achievement, making up and telling vivid, nuanced stories. So, those are 16 kinds of ways that people tend to express imagination. So, I want to try something right now. Those of you who are on devices where you can see a screen should be getting a poll in a minute. And this has 10 of those tendencies listed. Some of them are combined from the 16 since we can only have 10 answers. So it's an anonymous poll, so we're not collecting data about you in particular. Take a minute to read it and then click on one that makes the most sense for you, that fits best. And if more than one fits, just take a guess about which fits more for you. We got 2 people answered, and 3, 5. See if we get 10 of you to answer. Got 7. There, we got 11. And we won't close it quite yet in case you want to still answer. We are all different. Look at that spread there of how we each use our imaginations. And yet each one of these is a very functional, worthwhile, helpful way for people to use in that built-in imagination capacity. No one way is better than the others, not even the one I like. Now, my father, for instance, was very good at the crafting things kind of imagination. My dad could look at a piece of wood and imagine what to carve out of it, and then carve some really amazing things. One of the my favorite things he made of wood, my brother got this one to keep, was created after he had tried to explain to us kids how locks and keys work. And we were not getting the picture in our heads. We just couldn't visualize what was happening inside the door. So he took an old fashioned design for a barn door lock with a big wooden key and built that lock in a box with pieces of wood inside that the key could connect with and move. And then, so that we didn't have to imagine what we weren't able to see, he put a plexiglass window in the box instead of a solid wall. He was using his imagination to compensate for his kids having a bit of a failure of imagination. And when my dad took up pottery, he was also great at imagining a shape and then bringing it into being. Now, those were kinds of imagination that we didn't share. But he and I shared another kind of imagination that I really appreciated. And that was the ability to see optical illusions. And most of the time, to be able to switch between the two very quickly. So here's another example of an optical illusion of the kind my dad really loved. He actually built a small box for our stuffed animals to be able to enact this kind of illusion for us. And I will just note as a connection that, when you see giants and very small people in a science fiction film, this is usually how they do it. We imagine with some help from the visual cues other had the imagination to create. And my dad and I also shared an appreciation for impossible objects, ones in which our imagination gets completely confused. We try to make these into concrete reality, but you just can't. On the other hand, my dad was not particularly fond of stories and fiction. That kind of imagination just didn't interest him. I would observe that the story poem I started with came out of several of these different types of imagination. It was much more grounded in concrete reality and being able to imagine that clearly than, say, a science fiction story, or a conspiracy theory with some political agenda. And it was still about imagination. It might not have been your favorite way to use imagination, and that's why you might not have reacted as positively to the story as others did. Freeing our imagination means to me to learn to be more flexible. If I'm right and all of these different kinds are functional, we would have a lot more tools in our mind's toolbox if we expanded the different ways we use imagination. For some, we have limits on our imagination imposed by early childhood conditioning. My father was really good at the crafting part of imagination, uh, but one of the effects of that was he was very critical of anything I tried to make. He, I know, meant to be helpful, but that constant criticism meant that I developed a serious lack of confidence and just avoided any of the kind of crafting that he did. In some ways, I think of the whole idea of a society for ethical culture as an act of imagination. Ethics itself is an act of imagination. Ethics is not a description of hard facts or even factual information about what people do. Ethics is a prescription about what we should do if certain circumstances come up. The whole idea that we have a personal, unique best that ethical relationships will help us bring out, that's an act of creative imagination. Who is that better self I can strive to be? How might I act to bring out that better uniqueness in others? So, to build a more ethical world, we need our imaginations, and we need all the different variations on imaginations: the builders, the crafters, the artists, the visionaries, the planners, the wonks, the reflectors, the out of the box, and the connect the dot people. We need them all. So, how can we actively work to free our imaginations? I think it does begin by noticing that there are different options than our usual preference. That's one of the reasons I put up the poll. Differences are helpful if we appreciate them, rather than putting them into some hierarchy of value where usually our way is on the top. And if we and we need to avoid thinking that there's only one right way to use imagination, because that can stifle our options. And second, as my family stories may indicate, it's important to find supportive people who encourage rather than criticize how you're using your imagination. If you've constantly been programmed as a child, you've got those messages still hanging around in your head. Don't daydream. That's not good enough. Stay grounded. That can't happen. You'll be disappointed. Part of healing requires having different experiences, including having people in your life who encourage your attempt to imagine. And third, as a way of freeing our imagination, I think we need to be careful when imagination becomes a means to reinforce our worst rather than bring out our best. Not everyone who encourages certain kinds of imagination has your best interests at heart. Destructive imagination separates you from what might be helpful, even life saving. Destructive imagination encourages risky behaviors, literally drinking the Kool Aid for those who know of the Jim Jones and People's Temple event. Of course, I also believe that the imagination is best exercised in partnership with our more rational skills of skepticism, fact checking, and reality testing. And you'll hear more about that in the platform at the last week of the month. But fourth, I think it's very helpful to just practice some of the other forms of imagination, even if we're not as comfortable or expert with them. The more we've been programmed to avoid some of them, the more thought we might have to put into trying them out, seeing how they might work. I was in a group recently where, as an exercise towards setting group goals, The facilitator asked us all to imagine what the group could be like 5 years in the future. Well, for some people in the group, that was just too difficult to do, and they objected to the exercise. So the facilitator suggested that they pretend they could imagine the future. And I have to say that some of the most creative insights that day came from those who thought that they could not do it. So the fifth way to free imagination is that we really need to give our imagination time and space. If we're always busy, if we're always interacting with our screens, if we're always doing work, we probably don't have time for imagination. I find for myself, imagination works best in two circumstances. One is when I am taking a walk or a drive somewhere, and I can just let my mind wander enough. I'm between tasks and accomplishments. I have some focus on where I'm going, but I have a lot of mental freedom to let my mind imagine. And the other time I'm really good at imagining is when I'm in the shower. Again, I have that freedom for that time to let my mind really wander. Where can you be free of the usual pulls on you to do? And where can you be as free from the fears about imagining as possible? So I'm going to come back now to that how essential imagination is to the ethical journey. Imagine a world where people treat us as our very best selves, not how we look or what they think of us or what they think we should be doing. Imagine a world without racism, sexism, classes, homophobia, anti Semitism, xenophobia, ageism, sizeism. Imagine relationships where people treat us as our best selves, calling on those best selves, not playing on our worst impulses. And imagine as well that we could create an ethical gym, a place to exercise in order to bring out the best in others and ourselves, to practice and build skills, building them slowly. What would be the treadmill in the ethical gym? What would be the recumbent bike, the rowing machine? What would lifting weights be like in our ethical gym? What do we need to stretch? What do we need to practice lifting? What do we need to repeat often? What would it mean to build our core ethical muscles? What machines would our gym need to develop specific ethical muscles? What running track might we want? How might we develop our compassion muscles, our skepticism muscles, our imagination muscles, our ability to breathe well and deeply, our clear heads? Well, that's freeing our imagination. What do we need? What do we all need to help build towards this ethical world that we also imagine could be possible? And what can we do tomorrow or Tuesday or each day to get what we need for our ethical building project?